if you are here for Big Brother Meets Bedlam, and we're just going to give it a few more seconds for folks to sign in. If you are here for Big Brother Meets Bedlam, I'm hearing an echo. I think that's Karen. Seconds for folks to sign in. Can you? Okay, that saved it. For whatever reason, I guess there's a little bit of a delay, so that when I was speaking, I was hearing myself speak back to myself. I am seeing a couple more folks coming in, so I'm going to let them do that. And then we'll get started in just a moment. Okay. Great. Again, my name is Lydia X.C. Brown, pronouns they, them, sign name L. Brown. I am a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, wearing a dark polo, a jade necklace. I am a youngish East Asian person. I'm hearing it coming from somewhere else, but not through my own device. I am a youngish. I mean, I can turn off my own volume and then I won't be able to hear anyone else. Oh, that may be it. Because I don't, does anybody have the live stream link open? Okay, problem solved. The echo has been solved. I was just describing myself. My background that's on screen is what I call my fake Zoom mansion. It shows a glass, concrete, and wood-filled space with soaring windows, an angular ceiling, and grassy hills, a tree, and a lake behind it. I wish that I lived there, but I don't. I'm a policy counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology's Privacy and Data Project. And recently, I was the lead author of a report that CDT published on surveillance technologies and disability discrimination, which you can access online at our website. We'll drop the link into the chat box for you if you are interested in taking a look at our work. That report examined the emergence of automated and algorithm-driven surveillance technologies in 4 key areas of society, including the use of surveillance tech affecting disabled people in the educational context, in the employment and hiring context, in the healthcare context, and in the criminal legal system. And all of these different spaces where carceral technologies emerge pose particular risks of harm and active danger to disabled people, especially those of us who are at the margins of the margins. Those technologies can include everything from predictive policing software to automated test proctoring programs, to medications and medical devices that track users' quote unquote compliance, and a software at work that tracks workers' productivity, time spent on the job, and time spent taking breaks or stealing time away from an employer. Today, I've convened a panel of experts to talk about the particular emergence of mental health surveillance technologies and how activists, organizers, and advocates are resisting the expansion of carceral control through surveillance tech in the mental health context. Before we get started, just a couple of quick reminders about access and for housekeeping. Number 1, we do have captioning available. So if you would like to view the captions, you can click the button for CC at the bottom of your screen, and it will allow you to view the captions as a bar that you can move around, or you can open them in the sidebar or in a separate window. You are also able to view interpretation on screen into American Sign Language. If you are having any trouble with accessing the captions or interpretation, please feel free to send us a message in the chat box and we will do our best to troubleshoot and to make sure that access is happening, because access is very important. We are live streaming and recording this event. So if you would like to ask questions anonymously, you can do so using the Q&A button, which is at the bottom taskbar of the Zoom window. You can submit the question with your name or as an anonymous question. If it is anonymous, then we will not reveal or be able to reveal your identity when we consider those questions for you. You also may be watching this live stream on YouTube, and if so, you can still submit questions. You can send your questions by email to questions@cdt.org, or you can send your question on Twitter using hashtag CDT questions. And our Twitter handle, which is @CendDemTech for Center for Democracy and Technology. Our team will be monitoring all of those channels because we do not wish to miss your questions. And lastly, the chat box is open, so you are able to communicate with other folks attending in our chat today, but bear in mind that folks who are using screen readers may wish to turn them off for the duration of this panel in case there are a lot of messages. And our moderator will be occasionally voicing some of the comments that are in the chat so that those who are using a screen reader are able to access that information. Now, I have been withholding the exciting part of this panel for a bit long, so I'm going to turn now to introduce Karen Nakamura, who is our moderator for today's events. Professor Karen Nakamura is a cultural and visual anthropologist at the University of California, Berkeley. She is currently working on a project on disability, technology, and access, especially in the context of artificial intelligence, AI, ML. And importantly for me, she's a member of the advisory committee for CDT's project on disability rights and AI. Karen, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. My name is Karen Nakamura. My Sei name is K going down my hairline. It used to be much longer. I am an Asian American genderqueer person with graying hair. I'm wearing a green t-shirt from Microsoft that says AI for accessibility. It's a little bit ironic today to be wearing this. And I am very honored to be moderating. One of the notes I want to mention before is we are going to be using a variety of synonyms to talk about occasionally mental illness, psychosocial disability, mental health. I identify as someone with psychosocial disabilities myself as a mad scholar. And so we use a variety of terms. Some people like to talk about themselves as consumers, users, or survivors of the psychiatric system. There are many synonyms, and we encourage everyone will be using terms that they find to be the most integral to themselves and their experiences. And we don't mean any offense to people who prefer other terms as well. So with that brief note about language, I want to move to our two really excellent panelists, and they'll introduce themselves in the context of the work that they do. So the first panelist I want to introduce is Leah Harris. And I wondered, Leah, can you introduce yourself and describe your work on mental health and disability?
Yes, thank you so much, Karen. I'm Leah. I use they or she pronouns. And I apologize, I don't know my sign name, but I am going to learn it ASAP. So apologies for that. I am a middle-aged, firmly middle-aged European person. I am non-binary. I have short brown hair. I'm wearing a black sweatshirt with white tie-dye stripes, and my background is blurred. And just in terms of identification, I identify as a second generation MAD disabled psychiatric survivor, and I appreciate all of those notes, Karen, as to language and the diversity of the ways that we understand ourselves. Also consider myself a neurodivergent person. And I'll just share briefly, I got into this work as an advocate after my mother's death in 2001. She is the first generation psychiatric survivor. She'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young adult and had been involuntarily treated, coerced, force medicated, and surveilled in the analog ways for her entire adult life until she died very young at the age of 46. And I didn't know it, of course, at the time, but we know that so many of our disabled and MAD comrades die young, and that ocean of disabled grief is really endless. So I want to speak to that. So after she died, her death sent me on a bit of a quest to figure out what the hell happened. You know, I had some outlines of the story. And in that process, I was able to connect with a movement of psychiatric survivors. I connected with the disability community and began to have my own education about all of these issues. I've been going ever since. For the last 20 years, my work as a writer, trainer, and speaker has focused on the elimination of involuntary treatment, coercion, and restrictive interventions, and more recently on psychiatric abolition as part of the broader movement for abolition. I've been concerned with various forms of surveillance, you know, starting with the analog ones many years ago, and really how power and coercion and oppression are reproducing in these ever more high-tech and sophisticated ways with new tools. But I think as we hope to, I'll speak for myself, as I hope to establish today, it's kind of more of the same, right? Just under a different sort of technological layer. So I will leave it there for now, but thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much for a very moving introduction. Our second panelist is Vesper Moore. Vesper, I was wondering if you could introduce your work, especially at the Kiva Center and on mental health and disability.
Absolutely. So my name is Vesper Moore. I use they, them pronouns, they, ella pronouns you'll see on the screen. Ella pronouns are gender neutral pronouns in Spanish. My sign name is V and then Moore, and do the M. Not that great at signing yet, still working on it. And in terms of an image description, I have shoulder length black hair and a beard. And behind me is a white wall with two gourds. One gourd is representative of an ancestral spirit, cacique. And then the other one is a shamanic rattle. And then I also have a lemon tree behind me. My work, wow. So I work as the Chief Operating Officer at the Kiva Centers. I identify, I would say, my work as, first off, a MAD activist and a disability rights activist. Simultaneously, though, I do recognize that often people will think of that more as like mental health activism and, you know, disability rights activism. And I think what's important to differentiate there is that I would consider myself on the more radical end of that spectrum, seeking to subvert and defy some of our ideas pertaining to mental health and the experiences that encompass mental health. So along with that, the work that I've done is as a Chief Operating Officer at the Kiva Centers, help start peer respites, community initiatives, many different peer-run initiatives in the community. We are an Indigenous-led peer-run organization. That's very important because I believe peer support is inherently Indigenous. The concepts of restorative justice, the concepts of connection and centering connection. I also consider myself an international political activist. And the reason why I say that is because I do a lot of work with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, around strategies for psychiatric survivors and disabled people. And there's so much evolving there and so much happening there, right? More often than not, they refer to us as folks with psychosocial disabilities. There's many different identities there, many different pieces there. Excited to be here with you all throughout this panel and talk about surveillance in many regards.
Thank you. And from the chat, our organizers remind us that today's panel is a partnership between CDT and Kiva Centers. And you can find out more about Kiva Centers at their website, kivacenters.org. So I wanted to ask both of you, and you can decide who you want to respond first. In the description for this panel, there is a brief note about a new version of Abilify, which has the ability to inform doctors whether or not the patient taken is in compliance. And I'm using large air quotes because I hate the term compliance with taking the psychiatric medication. But both of you have been working on other dimensions as well. So I wanted to ask you, just how does surveillance technology affect those with psychosocial disabilities? Leah?
It's an excellent question. There's so much to say when we talk about surveillance and people with psychosocial disabilities or disabled folk at large. And I think a good place to start is the fact that we've always been surveilled. We've always had different circumstances of it. I think right now what we're seeing is more particularly technological advancement, in quotes, outpacing political regulation, policy regulation. And you may have heard the Biden administration recently released some regulation around particularly how it's a data privacy plan and the protection of persons' data. But this hasn't applied a lot when we talk about mental health apps, when we talk about emerging concepts with mental health technology. So I just want to start there, is that there's a whole new type of surveillance that we're encountering, new forms of oppression that our community will be experiencing.
Leah?
Yeah, so appreciate those thoughts, Vesper. And to add to that, and I have some notes here, so if I'm looking down, that's why. I just think it's so important to reemphasize, and this is also very clearly stated in the CDT report, that the algorithm, AI, whatever we're working with, is not value neutral, even though very often in the press, it's kind of pitched as a thing that's neutral, that exists in the world and is making all of our lives so much better. But as we know from the scholarship of so many folks, I'm thinking of Ruha Benjamin, New Jim Code, right? So many others. This is again in the CDT report, that these algorithms always carry baked in biases, right? That exist in the world and in the thinking of the people who are creating this. And of course, we know it's Black and brown disabled people. It's those with multiply marginalized identities that are always going to be the most harmed, coerced. I don't even like the language of at risk, because it's like, well, who put them at risk, right? So, I look at it as oppressive behavior and punishing, coercive, carceral behavior as a result of surveillance tech. And another piece that I might want to bring into the mix here is that there seems to be a trend around, as you all know, there's a huge shortage of mental health workers, right? So there's a trend here that, we're creating these tools to compensate for this shortage so people can get the care they need, right? That's kind of the narrative. But it really, these individualistic kind of solutions, first of all, ignore where did this shortage of care workers come from, right? Late stage capitalism, austerity policies, murderous policies, burnout, right? All of these different things. And maybe we can talk about this a bit more later, but I just saw a study, and I'll drop a link in the chat. It's out of the University of Washington, claiming that algorithms are as good as trained evaluators at identifying, quote, red flag language, unquote, in text messages from people with, quote, serious mental illnesses. That's the language they use. And so that's just one example, right, of this idea, you know, and how this is pitched, you know, and promoted to the press, is that, you know, this is going to help, you know, with the care shortage, because we can, you know, have a way of knowing if people are, you know, getting sicker, right? And so I'm really, really concerned about that. And then, you know, I want to also, you know, kind of thinking about how this lands specifically on people with psychosocial disabilities. I'd love to uplift a quote from Dr. Damian Patrick Williams, who's a professor of philosophy and data science at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And it's in another report that I will drop a link in the chat to, that is the Digital Futures in Mind report that I contributed a teeny tiny bit to. So in the foreword, Dr. Williams writes, and I'm quoting here, "News coverage of algorithmic health systems rarely, if ever, discuss the individual and social harms of algorithmic datafication." So the fact of being rendered into statistical formulae, I don't know how you pronounce that, for the training of mental health or machine learning models. And awareness in the general public is most often concerned with the convenience and ease of life supposedly offered by the systems and their purveyors than any negative externalities on disabled people, especially on people with lived experience of psychosocial disability. So I really just want to push back on the kind of techno-optimism that guides this whole conversation, and really kind of think about like really honing our techno-skepticism, which is a term I got from Anjali Nath Upadhyay from Liberation Spring. So kind of approaching this all with deep techno-skepticism. So I'll leave it there for now.
The report that Leah, this is Karen Nakamura, the report that Leah mentioned, Digital Futures in Mind, has been posted to the chat. You can save the chat messages as well if you want to access them later. It seems to me, I mean, we've long known that people with psychosocial disabilities are more often victims of violence than perpetrators of violence, and yet we're always portrayed as the perpetrators, and that becomes the excuse for especially the older analog forms of incarceration and control. And it seems to me that this is also happening with what you're saying, Leah, with these new digital forms, and that they talk about the violence suppressed, but they mask the violence that's being perpetrated on people with psychosocial disabilities. I wonder if either of you want to comment on other ways that this surveillance technology affect people with psychosocial disabilities, not just the overt forms, but perhaps some of the more subtle ways.
I want to say there's so many ways in which it impacts us, and particularly not even in intentional ways across the board. So, I mean, when I talk about intentional ways, I mean, I think it's generally with the intention of profit and profiting off of individuals. And the idea of when we talk about what surveillance is, right, and what the utilization of information does, when you think about like a company like Amazon, right, if you were looking at books about suicide, right, that the machine learning algorithm, right, I'm not going to personify it and say the algorithm, right, or the AI, but rather that machine learning, right, is what it's going to do is then determine what might relate to suicide. And there have been instances where or an instance that I'm referencing directly, where someone was looking up books about suicide, and then they said, like, well, people who like this book about suicide might also like rope, in reference to a noose, suicide, right? So that's an unintentional way in which that machine learning can impact someone. In a more intentional way, right? How this information is then utilized, these predictive models can just take this idea of like, oh, okay, you might like this item, so then you're going to look at this item, and it actually creates what people are describing as an addictive relationship, right, with devices and with a variety of things. Now, I want to say that addictive relationship is kind of very surface level what people think of, right? When you submerge a little bit further, you have things like particularly digital phenotyping. So digital phenotyping is how you engage with your device, right? So if you adjust your brightness a little bit lower, maybe you're not feeling very happy, and maybe you don't have a lot of energy, right? And you're looking at your cell phone and you were to adjust it a little bit lower. Let's say there was an app that measured how often you adjusted the light settings on your cell phone, right? To then determine that you are depressed, right? So using a diagnostic model based on how you engage with technology, what you might be looking up, what information might interest you, right? Then you get into the other sector. You have therapy groups such as BetterHelp, right? And I think having therapy that is accessible it is important, right? But access to what is something that I think is so important when we talk about surveillance technology and information. BetterHelp's data privacy plans are not secure. They can actually share that information amongst for-profit sectors because they are a for-profit company, and they can use that to better market to other individuals based on your experience with receiving that therapy. Then there's the example of the crisis text line, which I'm sure we could talk about in more depth, where they sold information about individuals who were reaching out for support, right? Or rather didn't sell that information, but transferred that information to a for-profit organization under the same umbrella. So there's digital privacy issues. So you talk about surveillance, right? You're talking about that machine learning piece where there's that predictive technology and the impact of that. But then it also goes into who actually owns the information of like what you're engaging with. If you're engaging on a mental health app, right, and you're writing about your state of distress, is your state of distress and what is reported, does that belong to the company that's on that app? Does it belong to you? Does it belong to Samsung? Does it belong to iPhone? Who owns the information?
Thank you. And I know that the companies actually pour over those transcripts quite carefully, try to mine all the data they can. So that's really important. Thank you, Vesper. Leah?
Yeah, super, super important points. And yeah, you know, just to build on that a bit, there's such an obsession with prediction, you know, like just what Vesper talked about, you know, we have predictive analytics in suicide prevention, right? So that's engaging natural language processing to look at the electronic health record. And again, the idea is that, oh, these mental health workers are so overworked and, you know, we need this to save lives. And if you oppose this, that means you don't want to save lives. That's how they gaslight you, right? And so there's this obsession with prediction. So I consider that to be a form of surveillance, absolutely. And you know, my question has always been, you know, with these high-tech interventions, you know, once the person has been flagged, what happens? And I never get a good answer, but we can guess, given how extremely carceral suicide prevention is, right? So that's, just one example. What happens to that person? What happens to their autonomy? And then there's also the threat assessment piece, right? Which is kind of like, okay, now we're all obsessed with predicting suicide over here. Now we're going to predict who's going to be dangerous over there. And I don't know if y'all remember, I know many of us have blocked out much from the years of Trump, but it was in 2019, I believe, I forget exactly when, but there was this brilliant idea to create a new agency modeled after DARPA called HARPA, which would be a healthcare agency that would actually monitor the cell phone usage, exactly what Vesper talked about, right? All of those kinds of ways of surveilling, monitor the cell phone usage of voluntary people, diagnosed with severe mental illness or people who have psychosocial disabilities, to try to predict, who's going to become the next mass shooter. And, we know that that's just wrong. It's like ethically, morally wrong. And given what Karen, you also said about, those of us, with psychosocial disabilities, much more likely to be the victim of violence than the perpetrator, it's just factually wrong. It's based in a falsehood, right? But, these kinds of things scare me, right? Because as political winds shift and change, right, these kinds of ideas can always be revived, right? That really, really terrifies me. And then another piece that I wanted to mention is geolocation. We can absolutely get into more of that if we want to, but so for those of you who maybe have not been closely following the unrolling of the 988 new suicide prevention hotline, it's also a crisis line. So it's not just for suicide prevention. And just like people can call 911 on other people, people can call 988 on other people, right? And so 988 does not currently include geolocation, but I can tell you, as someone who was involved in the planning process to just do whatever I could to have it be less ableist, less horrible, and less carceral, people really wanted that geolocation technology. Crisis line operators, and I'm not speaking for every crisis line operator because there are some ethical ones out there, but they were hungering and thirsting for geolocation. And I think it was a huge disappointment that for now, it has not yet, been approved or kind of been operationalized within 988. And I can tell you there's still lots of folks within suicide prevention, carceral suicide prevention, who are pushing for it.
Wow, that was really chilling. And you're right, the profit motive is on how do we stop pre-crime. And Anna in the chat says, remember the movie Minority Report? HARPA sounds like something from this dystopian future warning movies. And I think they're exactly right. This is all about pre-crime, and there's enormous money in pre-crime. There's very little money or very little willingness to fund creating the type of environment where people feel included, where they feel belonging, where they feel care. And a lot more funding into creating environments where people feel excluded, where they feel monitored, surveilled, controlled, especially in the educational environment. And speaking as someone who's neurodiverse, I also often think of the amount of incredible sort of energy, labor that we go into to present a demeanor that is neurotypical. Don't stim, maintain eye contact, and so forth. And many of the new surveillance technologies and the CDT report talks about how, for example, exam monitoring software is monitoring for your eye contact and making sure that you're not doing anything, atypical, enforcing neurotypicality. And it's that moment of intersectionality when I mentioned a person who was African American, and because the software had trouble with darker skin tones, they had to have a bright light shining in their face so that the software would recognize them. But you can imagine taking an exam, I think it was a bar exam, with a bright light shining in your face, as if you're in an interrogation room, which is very much, I think, the context of this. But the labor that goes into maintaining, the energy that goes into maintaining typicality, neurotypicality, is enormously draining. And so further debilitates, I think, our communities. So I just mentioned this in the context of the next question, which is what kinds of surveillance technologies particularly concern you as an advocate? For me, it is the proctoring, it is the various forms of classroom technology, but that's as an educator. As advocates, activists, what ones concern you?
I'm going to say Abilify MyCite, just to start, which is referenced like right at the top when we talk about this. And if you're not familiar with Abilify MyCite, it is an ingestible. That's what it's categorized as. And it is a pill that for a certain period of time can then, well, surveil whether or not you are taking your medications, right? How much of that, to what point, right? And I think when we talk about disability rights, there are some folks who are like, well, I might not remember to take my medication. Well, I might not, and this is when we get into the intersection, particularly of, we talk about psychiatric survivors, people who have survived the psychiatric system, the mental health industrial complex, and have, really, really talked about the experience of like, okay, well, if I want to get off of my lithium, right? Or if you're someone like me who is on, lithium and Abilify at the same time, right? And the side effect of lithium and Abilify made me suicidal and I needed to get off of those medications, but my psychiatrist felt like I needed to be on those medications. If I were to have a type of Abilify that was saying whether or not I was taking my lithium and I couldn't negotiate, right, to get off of my medication, I am stuck having that. I'm suicidal and I want to die, right? And what's going to happen to me, right? This is when we get into consent, autonomy, a lot of these issues. And I referenced digital phenotyping earlier, particularly because digital phenotyping in some regards for predictive models and a lot of these things, for something like diabetes, it could work well, right? But and then often when we talk about private and public sectors of government and industry, right? They're like, oh, okay, well, if it works for diabetes, why don't we make it work for mental health, behavioral health, right? It's just that easy, right? There's no question of like, what does that do to someone's autonomy, the idea of informed consent? Do we exist in a culture of informed consent in the first place, since the United States markets psychiatric drugs and medications and is one of 2 countries in the world that does that? So these are all important points and pieces. Particularly, I think another issue is 988, which isn't really like, it's not necessarily like a form of tech, right? That's impacted, but it's a form of potential, like really, really harming surveillance, right? That we can foresee. So Abilify MyCite, 988, digital phenotyping and advancements and no regulation of it, right? Because we have politicians who do not understand the technology and innovation is outpacing regulation.
Yeah, everything that you said, Vesper. I also, want to add a little bit about Abilify MyCite. And I'll share an article that talks about this from this year. But some of you, it was a great piece in Slate by Jane Cho, which I'll put in the chat. But I don't know if some of you remember that video that was going around featuring the Pfizer CEO. I think the last name is Burla. talking exactly about these digital pills. The video was from 2018, talking specifically about Abilify MyCite, I believe. And it was sort of blown up very much more recently this year by anti-vaxxer types who were sort of co-opting this to say, hey, see, they really can, track you and your medications and, vaccines, but I was upset about that, because it's co-opting the actual issue, right? Which is tech companies and pharma companies trying to figure out how to cash in on the supposed problem of non-compliance. And in this article, she cites Lisa Cosgrove, who's a scholar, talking also about the financial implications, right? That Abilify was going to be off, it was going to be patented, or it was going to go off patent, basically. So it's no longer was not going to be a huge cash cow for Pfizer. So what a perfect way of, keeping that money train going. I believe Abilify MyCite is like $1,700. Is it a day? Something like that. Something just absolutely outrageous like that. So it's really, about keeping that money train going. That's a big piece of it. And then, the other point that I wanted to raise that Jane Cho talked about, and I don't hear all that often, is the implications, right? If somebody is being coerced into taking this medication, the implications of a 6% false positivity rate. So even if you are absolutely able to comply perfectly. I mean, the tech is difficult to use. You need to have a patch in the right place. For people who theoretically can't comply with taking a pill every day, it's a lot of requirements on you. So imagine you are able to get everything set up to make it work. If there's that 6% false positivity rate, and you say, but I did take the pill, who is going to be believed, right, in this world of power imbalances, right? So that, that piece is frightening, right? When the app transmits this information that's wrong. So I'm equally concerned with the coercive use of digital pills. And the point I want to make too is there's always the comparison, like blood pressure, diabetes, we're going to control these conditions. But no, if you don't take your insulin, nobody is going to come to your house and drag you away or force inject you with insulin, right? So that's the difference. It's with these mental health diagnoses and psychosocial disabilities that you may lose your liberty and bodily autonomy in ways that are not comparable with other chronic illnesses or conditions. And just briefly, some of the other ones I already mentioned, any kind of predictive analytics concerns me quite a bit in suicide prevention or other spaces. I mentioned the threat assessment tech. That is another piece that is deeply, deeply concerning to me. For the most part, I mean, for many reasons, but also because it bakes in these understandings that we are dangerous, right? We are, a threat, and there's already enough of that. We don't need more of it.
Thank you. From the chat, Livia says, thank you, Vesper, for mentioning the digital phenotyping. This is one of the most concerning uses of passive data for diagnosis and prediction that deserves our collective attention. Vic says, given that current assessment methods for suicide prevention have at best a 50% chance of accurately predicting if someone will attempt suicide, it's troubling to consider the potential harms of automated methods of psychological assessment, especially if forced treatment is part of the intervention. Thank you both. Leah gives a slate piece. Leah gives the link to the slate piece. And Anna says, what is worse? Psychiatry says that it is still in the infancy stages when it comes to understanding human brain and psychopharmacology in the same breath. And yet, still, let's force them to take the meds and treatments we prescribe. I want to mention, in a few minutes, we'll be moving to the general Q&A. If anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A box at the bottom or you can post it as a question. Just make sure it looks like a question so that I ask it as a question. One of the things I should mention is the technologies in some ways are not new. Leah had talked in the beginning about analog forms, and many people who would have to take psychotropic meds, the doctors would do blood tests to see if they had the right levels. And so there was that monitoring, but of course it's expensive. The doctor doesn't want to go to that bother. And so what the new techs allow is this explosion of utilization. And as the cost comes down, we can expect it not to just be a few drugs, but more and more drugs. For the comparison, and that is truly scary, right? There is this doctrine of non-compliance, or this fear of non-compliance and control. From the diabetes perspective, it is interesting because for diabetics, insulin-dependent diabetics, they were constantly monitoring themselves, and they had the ability to control exactly the dosage. And folks who are taking who use the automated insulin delivery systems often talk about the lack of control that the device has. It is not telling them everything that it is monitoring, and it's not giving them the previous degree of control that they had. And so there was a brief flurry of activity for open insulin monitoring for people who are hacking their devices to better give them back the control and data that they used to have. And so, I often wonder, what other alliances can we build in this sort of larger infrastructure of how all of us are being monitored, all of our data is being taken away. It impacts, I think, people with psychosocial disabilities hard, and it impacts people with intersectional disabilities, racialized, minoritized folks, queer folks, particularly hard. The more categories you belong to, the harder it is. And so I look forward to these occasions for alliance building. I wonder, in the context of our last question, what should policymakers and researchers consider when they're thinking about using, funding, or developing these kinds of mental health technologies? Should they just give up, or how can they better implement them?
It's always such a good question, isn't it? Well, I mean, I think what you were just referencing with diabetes and self-determination and understanding that information, right? The importance of that. And there's a lesson to be learned there that can be similar in a lot of regards, right? When we're considering a lot of these technologies and these approaches. So I would advise a disability justice framework, right, that is led by people who would be impacted, right, by these technologies. Particularly when you think about things like BetterHelp, mental health apps, a lot of these things I was talking about, but also, with something like Abilify MyCite, for example, an ingestible that's monitoring what people take. I'm more on the end of I personally think that reaches a point, right, currently in the way in which we understand human privacy, human consent, like informed consent, that right now it's not something that we should really endorse or have. But Abilify MyCite was approved by the FDA like 5 years ago, right? It's been a while, so it's already out there, right? So I think the modification of concern could be what considerations are there for people who want to get off of psychiatric medications? What considerations are there, right, for someone who might be having adverse side effects with their psychiatric medications? What is being implemented there? Who are you inviting at the table? There's a lot of great organizations that support people in coming off of psychiatric medications, such as the Intercompass Initiative and many others. So I think I think something that's important there is if someone doesn't know how to safely come off of their medications, is it informed in the first place? And if you have an ingestible like Abilify MyCite that's monitoring things and reporting it to their psychiatrist, that's not really informed either. So I think a good place to start is data privacy policies with psychiatric survivors and disabled people. I think that goes both for government and organizations, private organizations, because I think that's another piece. We can talk about holding government accountable, but you can't really hold industry accountable in some of those same ways, right? Or you can, but it'll take a really long time.
Vespa, there's a question in the chat if you can maybe talk about, include some of the initiatives to go off medications. Maybe respond to that in the chat. In the chat, I wrote a quick quip that we should start a hack Abilify MyCite initiative where we try to crack the encryption, the technology, so that we can feed the doctors back any data that we wanted to respond to, and thus regain control over our bodies. And there are a couple of comments in support of that. Leah, do you want to talk about how we should lobby policymakers and researchers?
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to second everything that Vesper said again. If the research and development of apps, technologies of any kind is not led by disabled people, I guarantee the product or service will be trash at best and very harmful at worst. So just wanted to speak that out. And that so many times I've been brought in as a consultant, like as an add-on. See Vespers nodding their head. Yeah, it's like, no, you don't bring someone on to kind of tinker around the edges of what you cooked up. It's really from the beginning, right? That it's grounded in ethics and the principle of led by most impacted, right? Which is central to disability justice. Another piece that I would point out is that disability and mental health have, for the most part, and I think this is changing, but even as of a few years ago, was largely omitted from discussions about AI bias, right, and algorithmic accountability. So I think it's an ongoing push for making these connections, right, that Karen was talking about, for meaningful inclusion in these spaces. And then for the piece around informed consent, just and I mean when we talk about informed consent, there's lots of forms of informed consent, and I mean meaningful informed consent. So I think we need to be pushing for, it's not just a one-time opt-in, which you kind of have to do. For example, if you are in a suicidal crisis and you want to get support from crisis text line, you have to opt in to whatever garbage they're pushing. So I'm not talking about that. I think an area for advocacy is to really push for ongoing checking in about consent. It's not just a one-time deal, and giving people real choices about what happens with their data, not like two garbage choices, but actually, real meaningful choices. And I think another area for advocacy is to be calling out the conflicts of interest in a lot of these researchers who have a financial interest in the outcomes of their research. It's really just feeding the already out of control biotech industry. And then one other piece I want to mention, because I want to leave lots of time for questions, is media advocacy. So there's a fairly new set of guidelines that is out for journalists or people who are reporting on robots, AI, computers, that might be helpful to share out. And I will also put a link to that in the chat. So those are some of my thoughts for now in terms of kind of advocacy directions across kind of the different tentacles of what's happening at this point in time.
Thanks. Let me switch now to some of the questions from the attendees. The first one is, in terms of predictive analytics and predicting suicide, do you know what types of data points are used in making these predictions? Either of you?
You know, that's a good question. Do you know, Vesper? I know it's like a whole range of them, everything from sort of demographic data to other comorbid illnesses and zip code. You know, there's many more. Yeah, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's primarily what you're describing. I think when you're talking about predictive models, another issue that I wanted to highlight earlier as well is the idea of human intervention with machine learning models. Because when we talk about what is used when we're talking about predictive analytics and predicting suicide, yeah, it does have to do with demographic data. But would you assume that a poor brown person in a certain neighborhood, even though they might be more likely to attempt suicide, what if they led a richer life? You don't know that, right? So like, why would you use a machine learning model without human intervention to predict that? In terms of what is used for these predictive models, I think it varies. I think what Leah is talking about when we talk about demographic data and these specific things, we see that a lot, right, in public government, but we don't see it all the time in private industry. They are monitoring different things per their agreements. When you click the terms of service, you're agreeing to what they collect, and they update their terms of services constantly. That's another thing when we talk about regulation, right? The fact of like what is informed consent when what is in front of you is inaccessible, hard to read. It is long, right? So.
Yeah, and I know from one of my doctoral students who's working on this, the chatbots that are in the social network systems, you know, they're using natural language processing as well as AI ML to try to match against what the companies have previously said these are predicted texts, and so there's matching. Sometimes the matching is extremely obtuse, right? And there are some examples in the CDT text where it's like, oh, I bombed the exam, and a student gets flagged for using cinnamon. It's almost like you're constantly at a TSA checkpoint where you can't make any jokes whatsoever. Oh, I could just shoot myself because I got turned down to the prom. And so all this complexity of the context and nuance gets lost because they're just looking at snippets of data, but it isn't made any better by giving them the entire context. Partly because there aren't real good models of this, and the desire to seek better models gets into further and further privacy concerns, as Vesper mentioned. So many of us don't know that both Alexa and also Google Voice, as well as Apple ones, they collect all of our voice samples and our voice tidbits. And the race is on for who has the largest sample of voices, because that's how they improve their system. But our voices are forever locked away in these data servers. We don't have, when we signed up, we gave away our right to that.
If I can add too, I just want to say that like one of the challenges, right? A good example of this is if you think about Cambridge Analytica, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, you think about Mark Zuckerberg's standing trial, they didn't know what to hold him accountable for, right? This is the same thing. How do you know what to hold someone accountable for who is an executive director at a company that has a mental health app that has a lot of these digital initiatives, right? If you don't fully understand these concepts and what is encompassing and all of that information, again, is not accessible, and it's constantly changing what is being monitored and how.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a point to that too, and also piggybacking on what Vesper said and what Lydia shared in the chat about automated content analysis, like social media, platform content moderation algorithms. You know, there's many of us who don't feel comfortable calling any kind of hotline or engaging with the system. And so are people who feel comfortable reaching out on social media. And, now we found this hack that I've seen in a lot of neurodivergent communities. So instead of using the word suicide, they'll use the word unalive as a way to get around the algorithm. However, how long is it going to be until the algorithm starts flagging unalive, and then there's going to have to be new words? And so while I appreciate that ingenuity, creatively coming up with other terms, the problem remains. Sewer slide. Yes, absolutely. That's a really good one. Yep.
Yeah, we're becoming like China, where people are coming up all these synonyms to refer to the government or to the situation in Tibet or Xinjiang to evade the screening. From another question from the audience, part of the pitch for digital phenotyping is the support of psychiatric research, developing these phenotypes to gain more granularity about mental and behavioral health conditions. Is there a world in which this technology can be created or used by psychiatric system survivors to quantify or illuminate harms from the psychiatric system, as well as other digital harms that affect these populations?
Ooh. Wow. I mean, there's potential for considering how when we're thinking about trying to get because for digital phenotyping, mind you, it's for a composition of diagnostic criteria, right? So if you're talking about like how it relates to tech, it's difficult because how do you gauge something as it relates to mental and emotional distress, right? When it's based on how someone's engaging with that device. But I think, once again, when you're talking about human intervention, like let's say it is pertaining to an app that someone's engaging with for regular support, right? And there is a transparent process of like, hey, we haven't been chatting on this app for a little while, like something like that, where it's conversational, right? And the power is in the position of the person who's receiving that service. I think that's a different direction. But once again, if it's diagnosis based on how they're engaging with tech, right, without them understanding to what degree, what capacity, it's in a lot of ways, it's always going to be coercive and harmful. So I think that's an important point. Another important point too, to what Leah was saying about language and suicide, is that says a lot about, the criminalization of people with mental health diagnoses, right? People in emotional distress, the fact that we have to use different terminology online and what that surveillance looks like, right? And that impacts everyone. But I think out of that fear as well, when you talk about technology that's trying to find these diagnostic criteria and you feel like you're always being watched, how are you truly going to get a clear and fair sample and understanding that isn't tampered with from the person's fear of surveillance, right? So if I'm using my phone, right, and it was to that example, right, and I'm making these adjustments and I start using it less and less and less because I know that there's a potential that this is going to compose a diagnosis that I may receive or be labeled with, right? Then that's, I believe that wouldn't qualify as proper diagnostic criteria, right? You wouldn't get something that's clear, that makes sense.
Yeah. But Vesper, you might just see it in the next version of the DSM, which is, one of the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia is social withdrawal, but from my experience, that comes from people who don't understand you and who are trying to constantly deny your experience. Of course, you're going to withdraw from interacting with people that way. And if you digitally withdraw, I'm going to put in the DSM as digital withdrawal is a symptom.
Wow.
Leah?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I understood the question correctly, and I don't have a ton to add to what Vesper said, but my thought is that if we are not designing these models like by us and for us, I feel like and this is pretty much what Vesper said, is that anything that comes out of it is going to be of maybe limited utility because all of these biases and discrimination is just baked in to the tech.
And I wonder, as someone who comes from a nation and culture where suicide is understood as one's decision. In fact, the ultimate decision is how we say it in Japanese, the ultimate personal decision. Whether or not the vilification and surveillance of suicide is necessarily problematic. I think one can make that decision at moments, and I don't. It is the ultimate decision, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. But we use that as the justification for a whole slew of mechanisms of control. And often it's those mechanisms of control that would make that the rational for that moment decision that, hell, if I'm going to live a life that's not worth living, then I choose something else.
Yeah.
But that may not be a popular opinion.
I think yes, and contextualizing the experience of suicide, which is what we're alluding to, right? And that's some of the challenges that when we talk about things like 988, right, and you have teenagers in Texas or Florida, right, who are coming out as trans to their family, and their family's like, we disown you, right, and you feel suicidal, and you call and a local hotline picks up, right? What implicit biases are there?
Mm-hmm.
I think another important piece is if you look at the work of Dr. Joy Buolamwini, and when we think about facial recognition technology and implicit racism that exists, implicit bias that exists there, right? And that was due to the fact, right, that it was designed primarily by white men. So it would detect criminality in Black and brown faces and in women's faces, right? So I think that's an important piece too. We see this in other places, implicit bias as it pertains to the design process. I really recommend also a design justice framework, and learning more about design justice. I will drop that in the chat. There is a design justice like network that's come together. It's fairly new. It started, but it's very much in line to what we're talking about.
Yeah, everything that you both said, and I agree, that, if we're talking about ethics and, a framework that centers us, there is that autonomy of choice. And to me, what's wild, and sorry if I said this already, is, they're so obsessed with predicting, flagging, identifying, and as I think Vic mentioned, they're not even that good at it. But the question is, again, there aren't enough workers. There isn't enough of anything to support the people who are flagged, and that is completely ignored, as well as what, y'all mentioned in terms of, what are the reasons that someone would want to unalive themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is not a part of the conversation. It's just flag. And exactly. I always say, to what end? What's going to happen next?
Yeah. Well, we've gone a bit over time. There was one last question about consent and consent fatigue, and just how many times you give consent and the context in which we give consent. at the hospital, I give consent and they won't even give me a copy of what I signed because I'm signing a digital screen. And I think that's an ongoing issue. We don't have time perhaps to address it here, but we have willingly given up all of this information or willingly given up our ability to control it. But this is definitely an area, I think, where policymakers need to step in and say, put better controls around this question of consent, maybe a further discussion. Let me turn it back to Lydia with apologies for running a bit over time.
This is Lydia. Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. And the person who asked the question about consent fatigue, that's absolutely an ongoing conversation among a lot of us in the privacy advocacy space of, thinking through giving someone a button to click. Do you consent to have all this data collected about you? Then you can access this website. Most people are just going to click the button and they're not really thinking about it. So legally, they technically gave consent, but is that meaningful consent? Do people genuinely intend for every possible data broker to collect absolutely enormous amounts of information about them, hold onto it possibly forever, and sell it to basically anyone? And I think for many people, the answer would probably be, well, that seems a little bit sketchy, a little bit concerning. But different proposals have emerged in the privacy space about what to actually do about consent. And, one thing that comes to mind for me often, and I think is pertinent to our conversation, is restricting the kinds of data that companies can collect on people to begin with. Because if we're restricting and limiting what kinds of data companies can collect, how long they can hold on to it, what they can do with it, then that obviates the need to have to repeatedly ask people a frankly meaningless question of, do you consent to have everything about you collected and sold to the highest bidder? But we will be continuing this conversation. We have a series of panels in the works in which we will explore the other aspects of the surveillance and disability discrimination report. And we hope that you will join us for those conversations. We will be posting information on CDT social media and elsewhere. I want to take just a moment to thank and acknowledge my colleagues at CDT, especially Tim Hoagland from our communications team, and helping to make today possible, as well as Vesper and the Kiva Centers for working with us to organize today's event. And a special thank you to Jalen Rodzaminski, who unfortunately was unable to join us today at the last minute, but we know that the work that Jalen is doing is incredibly important and impactful, and certainly encourage you to look it up and to follow Jalen on social media as well. Please feel free to follow all of us online and keep up with our work. And lastly, an enormous thank you to our interpretation team and to our captioner for helping us ensure that we were able to practice language justice during today's conversation. Thank you and have a fantastic rest of your day.